Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about the final years of Stalin's tenure in office as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I'd like to begin today by talking about his death, its significance for Soviet politics, and then I'll turn to the topic of today's lecture, which is the problem of de-Stalinization, that is to say, the attempt of the party to move slowly away from certain features of the political system that Stalin had established. Now, a few years ago, actually more than a few, about 20 years ago, the American novelist and belletrist Gore Vidal wrote an essay about death scenes. It's a little bit macabre, as usual with Vidal. It's cynical and humorous, points hilarious. One of the death scenes that he forgot, or for lack of space didn't put in, was the death scene that attended Stalin. Stalin was an incredibly secretive and cautious man. He lived in a dacha for large parts of the year outside of the Kremlin. He had several bedrooms, which were all identical, and this was to avoid assassination. No one knew where on a given night he would sleep. Sometimes he worked late at his office, and his office was an inaccessible place in the compound. It was a place which was without window, which was sealed. There was only one access to it, and Stalin's habit was to meditate, decide things. He was a night owl, so he worked late at night. And then when he wanted to communicate to his aides, he would ring. Now, unfortunately, he was stricken. He had a stroke. And if we can imagine such a thing, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union and maybe in the whole world was lying for a number of hours helpless on his back. His aides outside waited and waited for the ring that never came, and finally they had to seek authorization from people in the Politburo of the party to permit them to gain access. And what they found was Josef Stalin stretched out next to a ottoman, a divan that he used to recline upon, and he was unable to speak and in fact never recovered this power. He lingered several days and died. Now my mother, unfortunately, a few years ago had a stroke, and she said the most frightening thing to her was that all the while she was lucid. It's just that she couldn't communicate. She knew absolutely what was going on, and she took stock of her life during this time when she was recumbent and unable to communicate. I wonder myself what Stalin thought in those hours that he lay alone, incapacitated. Did he think, for example, of the problem of succession? He had presided since 1945 over the government with an iron hand as before. He had a number of aides, 8 or 9 at a given time, Khrushchev, Molotov, Malenkov, until his death in 48, Andrei Zhdanov, a man called Kuznetsov, Kaganovich, who was a longtime aide. There were others as well. And Stalin shuffled these people back and forth from one post to another, I think to prevent them from consolidating a power base. His most dangerous rival, he certainly recognized, was Beria. Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria was the head of the secret police from 1938 until 1953. He was a man famous for his corruption and his legendary philanderies. No Soviet woman walking the streets of Moscow was evidently safe from his gaze, because he would literally order them abducted and then have his will with them. He was simply an awful man in the personal sense. But he was ruthless, he was shrewd, and of course he commanded the secret police, and this made Stalin worried about him. We know that in Stalin's last years that there were a number of campaigns that variously people in the hierarchy presided over. So, for example, Zhdanov, after the war, presided over a campaign to assert the greatness of the Soviet nation. And then there were campaigns that were aimed against intellectuals and against specifically Jewish people. For example, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign that began in 1949 resulted in the arrest of a number of prominent Jewish intellectuals. And in the case of Shlomo Michaels, who was the head of the National Theater, it resulted in his death. There were rumors in 1952 that there would be a blood purge on a very much larger scale, aimed specifically at Jews. Solzhenitsyn tells us in the Gulag that he has heard from other prisoners that there was a set of camps constructed with inscriptions either in Yiddish or in Hebrew, and apparently Stalin was preparing to send massive numbers of Jews to these hard labor camps when he died. There was a sinister atmosphere in the capital. There were rumors that doctors, Kremlin doctors, had killed Zhdanov in 1948 and then hushed this up. And Stalin was obviously preparing for a set of new show trials, which would put these Kremlin physicians, 7 out of 9 of which, incidentally, were Jewish in extraction, on trial. Now, I mention all this because this last so-called doctor's plot was probably aimed also at the removal of Beria. Beria was the head of the security police. His job was to preserve the lives of people high in the hierarchy. Zhdanov, who died in 1948, was the head of the Leningrad Party organization. If he had been done to death by Kremlin doctors, then Beria was to blame. So there was an atmosphere of instability that Stalin had created deliberately, and he had pointed arrows or hung a sword of Damocles over the head of his secret police chief. But of course, in his hours of incapacity, he could probably only lament that he had waited too long to cut the thread that held the sword. Stalin might have thought about what he had achieved. He had some real achievements. He had built the Soviet industrial economy at a horrific cost, yes, but the Soviet Union was one of the leading producers of metals and chemicals. This had been done in a short period of time. Stalin could say that he had presided over one of the greatest war efforts in human history, and he could make the realistic claim that it was none other than the Soviet army and the Soviet peoples that had stopped the Nazis. The war against the Nazis, I think, was not decided in France or by the American forces on D-Day and afterwards, although that certainly was helpful. It was really decided, I think, in terms of materiel and the Nazi losses at Stalingrad and in the Eastern Front. So Stalin could, in a world historical sense, say he had achieved something. And he could also claim plausibly that he had expanded the Soviet state left to him by Lenin enormously in terms of its territory. Think about 1953. The satellite states in Eastern Europe, from the Western perspective, were the Soviet buffer zone and the place from which it could project offensive power, if need be, into Western Europe. So this horrible man was, from the point of view of realpolitik, nevertheless, a great man. And he probably thought in terms that Bismarck thought of: do not reproach me for the immorality that I have undertaken, because you cannot judge a statesman by the same standards. This is what Bismarck said on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War to those people in the cabinet that reproached him, and maybe words of this sort came to Stalin's mind. After his death, of course, the matter would be judged by history and by the Soviet peoples. And we are going to talk now, as we think about de-Stalinization, about the judgment that they made. The survivors in the elite certainly made the judgment that Stalin's projection of power in the war and in Eastern Europe after the war, that these were right and good from the standpoint of the Soviet Union. They were committed, as he had been committed, to the proposition that never again would a foreign invader be permitted to attack the Soviet Union. They agreed absolutely, I think, about the atomic program and the hydrogen bomb program, which had come to fruition under Stalin's leadership in '49 and then the hydrogen bomb in '53. They, by and large, agreed with the proposition that the party should be the unchallenged master of the Soviet Union. This was a proposition that Lenin had first articulated, that Stalin had elaborated in many ways, and so on. But some of them certainly were desirous of eliminating the aspect of terror that was at the heart of the Stalinist system. There were humanitarian considerations, of course. I mean, one doesn't like to live in a terrorist state. One doesn't like to preside over it. But I don't think that these humanitarian considerations, except possibly in the case of Khrushchev, and even then I'm a little doubtful, I don't think these were decisive. I think the decisive considerations were self-interest of the leaders. If you live in a terror apparatus, if you live under a tyrant who lives by shuffling leaders back and forth, who survives by removing one and now the other, you are perpetually insecure despite your position and your power. It was in the interest of most of the leadership, therefore, after Stalin's death, to remove the element of terror, at least as it applied to people in the party. And so the early steps of de-Stalinization are all about making the party, and especially the elite of the party, more secure. Let me talk in some detail about what was done under Khrushchev in order to achieve these objectives. Now, as we contemplate the political situation in which Khrushchev found himself, we can see immediately that his first difficulty was to remove Beria from the office of Chief of Police. In the constellation of power that followed Stalin's death, most of the cards were held by Beria because he had the possibility of ordering the arrest of anybody in the Central Committee. Now, it was understood by other people as well in the leadership, Malenkov, Molotov, that Beria was a danger to them. The problem was, how do you articulate the need under such circumstances to remove somebody from power? And how do you effect their removal? Now, the difficulty of articulating the need to plan for the removal of Beria should not be underestimated. Offices were bugged, telephones were bugged, one couldn't trust one's neighbor. So it took a great deal of courage on the part of any of these people to speak the unspeakable about the need to remove Beria. And Khrushchev in some ways a very brave man. He had already spoken up to Stalin during the Ukrainian famine in the late 40s. He did take the lead, I think, on this matter, although we judge here principally by his memoirs, which of course advertise the fact that he was the one who was most bold. Once you had an agreement in principle that Beria needed to be removed, which didn't take a genius to figure out, the problem was how. Because Beria controlled the police. Normally, if you want to arrest somebody, you have to rely on the police. The party itself had no instrument of power. The police was out of the question. So Khrushchev and company had to depend on the third of the three powerful pillars on which the whole Soviet state had been constructed, and that third pillar was the army. And fortunately for Khrushchev and the others, in the army there were people who hated Beria and who were quite reliable, who were used to taking risk, who had looked death in the eye during the Second World War, and therefore people that would possess the will and the technical means to effect the arrest. There's an incredible description, and Khrushchev remembers, of how at a meeting of the Presidium Beria was confronted by his colleagues on the Presidium about his various crimes, and how at a dramatic moment Khrushchev signaled to generals. There were two of them. There was Marshal Zhukov, who was the commander at the Stalingrad front, who was maybe the most famous and decorated Soviet officer in the war, signaled to him and to an Air Force general named Moskalenko to come in and to arrest Beria. Imagine a cabinet meeting in Washington in which the president has to signal that somebody is going to be arrested, and in marches the army. I mean, it is by the standards of our history something that cannot be comprehended. But this is the kind of thing that happens when you have an undivided government. That is, no balance of powers, no checks and balances. Beria was arrested. He was tried in camera, in absentia, that is in a military tribunal, but he was not present, and then he was executed. And the law which was applied in his case was the law of 1st December 1934. This is the very law that Stalin had used in order to launch the terror against the party in the 1930s. And I mention this because of the significance. If Khrushchev was about slowly de-Stalinizing the country, we already see with this first step that the road to de-Stalinization was not going to be straight, because in order to de-Stalinize, one in the first instance had to use Stalinist laws. It's an odd thing, but this is the way historically it happened. Now, following Beria's trial, there was, which was not a public trial, two of his henchmen in other branches of the security apparatus, men named Abakumov and Rumin, were arrested, and they were tried in public. And this was very significant. There was a debate in the government about whether to have public trials or not. Khrushchev insisted on the principle of publicity. You know what the Russian word for publicity is? Glasnost. It's usually translated as openness in the Gorbachev area, but publicity. He insisted on glasnost, on a public trial. This was resisted by the Stalinist hardliners in the government, by people who didn't want already to go very far in the direction of de-Stalinization, because they thought that the more publicity, the more exposed they would be to the possibility of accusation and trial themselves. So there was a split in the government, and it is significant that already Khrushchev prevailed. Malenkov and Molotov were the principal hardliners that had opposed the public trial, and Khrushchev's victory here already led to Malenkov's resignation in 1954. Now, the struggle for de-Stalinization had only commenced, and in the next few years, Khrushchev made some very dramatic moves behind the scenes and in public. First of all, there was a kind of signal that was sent to writers that things were changing. There was a new wind. Ilya Ehrenburg, who was a Soviet writer, lived a long time in Western Europe, but lately he had been living in Moscow. A very savvy politician picked up the changing winds right away, and he wrote a novel called Ottepel, or The Thaw. And so it became fashionable in the wake of this rather daring novel for the time to speak of the literary thaw, and some people even write about the thaw generation. So the writers began to feel that they could experiment a little bit. Behind the scenes, Khrushchev began to collect data through a committee that was appointed by the Presidium to collect data about those party members who were illegally repressed, that is, illegally arrested, and in some cases put to death under Stalin in the 1930s. And his intention was to gather these names and then publicly to rehabilitate these people. Now, the term rehabilitation sounds odd to the English ear. It actually has legal implications. If you were rehabilitated, it meant that your reputation was restored. You could no longer be considered a non-person, so you could write in newspapers and so on. Legally, you had a right to go back to your old job, whatever that job would be that you were removed from. If you were of pension age, then you had the right to a state pension. You also had the right to receive back salary that you would have been paid had you not been removed illegally from your position. If the person being rehabilitated was dead, so there was a posthumous rehabilitation, then that person's relatives had the right to receive a state pension and all of the honors that would have accorded to that person. So the talk about rehabilitation was very significant from a legal point of view, let alone from a political perspective. Khrushchev in 1955, strengthened by the findings of this commission, issued a dictum that the camp system begin to respect the rights of prisoners. Now, that they did so is rather dubious, but the signal was to relax the very strict regime. Former camps that were really death camps, like the Kolyma camps in the northeastern portion of the Soviet Union, were noticeably relaxed, and they were still not picnics to be in, but they were not death camps either. And then in February of 1956, Khrushchev made the move that he had been waiting for. There was the 20th Party Congress meeting. At this 20th Party Congress meeting, he, as the elected first secretary of the party, he refused, incidentally, to call himself general secretary because that was too reminiscent of Stalin. As the elected first secretary, before the Central Committee and Presidium were elected, Khrushchev had the right to, as the sole elected person in the party, to make an emergency report. He summoned at midnight the delegates from the Congress from all over Moscow, so he routed them out of their hotels, is what happened, summoned them back to the Palace of Soviets, and he launched into a speech that quickly became known as the secret speech. Now, it wasn't very secret because a copy of it was leaked to the West. It was published in newspapers over here. It was broadcast, although jammed by radios, into the Soviet Union. But it was secret in the sense that it was not published in the Soviet Union itself. It was communicated through party channels. And so if you were a teacher of pedagogy, let's say, at Moscow University, and you hadn't heard the speech at the Congress, you received a copy of the speech, which you could read. Then you had to sign off that you had read it and return it immediately to the party personnel that had been the courier between the Central Committee and yourself. And so people got one chance, if they were in the party, to look at the speech. And if you were not in the party, then you didn't hear the speech except by rumor. What did Khrushchev say in the speech? Well, he said lots of things, and he didn't say lots of things. He left out the issue, the painful issue, of the non-party victims of Stalin. That he wouldn't talk about. He didn't talk about the question of responsibility, of broader responsibility for Stalin's crimes. Remember, I have pointed out that Stalin signed certain death lists, certain arrest lists, but the massive number of people who were purged in the party purges and in various other campaigns by Stalin, this massive purging could only have been done by people like, well, Khrushchev, Molotov, Malenkov, and all the tens and hundreds and thousands of party personnel at lower levels. Khrushchev didn't talk about that either. He didn't talk about the need to create a system of government that had checks and balances. This he left out of the question. However, he did say some very important things. He said there were tens of thousands of innocent party people that were arrested during the purges of the 30s by Stalin. He said that these people should be rehabilitated. He said that the party was, in a sense, morally responsible for this phenomena because it created something that Khrushchev called a cult of personality. It raised Stalin up on a higher pedestal than he should have been. Khrushchev was really cutting a man who styled himself as a god. He was cutting him down to human status. And he was saying implicitly that in the future, the leadership of the party should be collective. He attacked Stalin's mistakes in 1941, the failure to assess German intentions that I talked about. He talked about the military blunders of 41-42, which Stalin was responsible for. He attacked Stalin's policy of relocating the Crimean Tatars and the 5 Caucasian tribes, including the Chechens, from their homeland. He said that this was wrong, an excess, and a sin against the party and Soviet people. So Khrushchev, for all of the things he didn't say, said some very important things. And please keep in mind that these are judgments made by somebody raised in the Soviet system with Soviet standards. They're not my assessments. They're not coming from the mouth of some putative Cold War historian. They're not moralistic in the sense that they're religiously based judgment. These are political judgments that the next Soviet leader made about Stalin himself. And this we should attend to. Now, the secret speech was attended, as you would expect, by changes in foreign policy. There's always a linkage between domestic and foreign relations. You just have to look for it. Sometimes it's in strange places, sometimes it's obvious. In this case, Khrushchev made the following assertion, which was ideologically very significant. He said that the Soviet Union, although it was a socialist state in competition with capitalist states, could peacefully coexist with those capitalist states. He said that war between the socialist system and the capitalist system was not inevitable. Now, it had been a Leninist axiom and a Stalinist axiom that war between the competing systems was an inevitability. Khrushchev said, no, competition is inevitable. Later he would boast, we will bury you, but he didn't mean in the military sense. He meant that the Soviet economy and the socialist system would prove superior to the capitalist system. Now, he was quite apparently wrong in this, but this boast of we will bury you was misinterpreted by the popular press in the West, and the underlying importance of this ideological change of face is something I think had not been fully appreciated. Now, in Eastern Europe, this speech, the secret speech, and the change in foreign policy had a shockwave effect. It was like a tsunami in the Pacific, one of these incredibly violent and powerful storms. In Poland, the nationalist communists, led by Gomulka, thought that this was the time when they could remove the Stalinists who were in charge of Poland's government. They were catapulted into a position where they could take the power by student demonstrations, which would have been unheard of in the Stalinist period. In Hungary, reform communists, led by Imre Nagy, took power. They banished the Stalinists, and of course we know that this latter Hungarian uprising took at the very end a surprising turn, because the Hungarians who were going to be suppressed by the Soviets by force of arms appealed to the West for military support. They were not given that military support. Well, the empire then in Eastern Europe was shaken by these events. In Poland, the Soviets countenanced the change. In Hungary, they did not countenance the change. And gradually, by November of '56, they began to harden their line, at least insofar as the Eastern Europeans were concerned. By June of 1957, Khrushchev was in a political danger, a danger of losing his position. The Presidium of the party voted 8-4 to remove him from office. He appealed this decision, as it was his right to do, to the Central Committee, and the Central Committee overturned the decision of the Presidium. It was a dramatic event because Marshal Zhukov organized an airlift of Central Committee members from all over the Soviet Union to Moscow. It had to be done quickly in a 24-hour period. There was an explosive debate, and by the skin of his teeth, Khrushchev survived. Party people that voted for him were self-interested, you have to believe, because their jobs and their lives were forfeit if they lost. Wonderful punishment. Malenkov was already out. Molotov, who loved foreign affairs, had been a long-time foreign secretary, was made ambassador to Mongolia. You know, Khrushchev had a certain poetic quality to him. This survival by the skin of the teeth affected the pace of de-Stalinization. It became clear to Khrushchev that he could not proceed forward rapidly as he might have wished. And so from 57 to 61, we hear very little from Khrushchev about Stalin's crimes. Really, we hear nothing. The party pursued a harder ideological line against literature. In 1958, Boris Pasternak received the Nobel Prize for the novel Dr. Zhivago. It was a novel, the manuscript of which was smuggled out of the country. It was published for the first time, I believe, in Italy, in a Russian language press there. It was embarrassing to the party, because the Soviet Party, because it was not published in the Soviet Union. Pasternak was not permitted to go to Stockholm to receive his prize. This was Stalin's revenge against him. Broader de-Stalinization did not begin until 1961. And for the last years of Khrushchev's reign, there was an attempt to push the limits, expand the envelope of freedoms that were available to party members and non-party members. At the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, Khrushchev spoke of the non-party victims of Stalin. And he now spoke not of tens of thousands of innocent victims, but of millions. So here again, I remind you, a Soviet leader making a judgment about Stalin, and this one astonishing. After the Congress, Stalin's body was removed from the Lenin mausoleum. They had built a second crystal sarcophagus. They put Josef Vissarionovich in state, right aside Vladimir Ilyich. This second sarcophagus was removed, and Stalin was reburied behind the mausoleum, between the mausoleum and the Kremlin wall. Under Brezhnev, incidentally, a tall statue with a bust of Stalin on the top of it was erected. It says simply Stalin. There's a funny poem, not so funny actually at the time, but funny in retrospect, written by Yevgeny Yevtushenko in 1961 when they took Stalin's body out there behind the mausoleum. Yevtushenko said, "Pour cement on it, more and more, so he'll never rise again." There was a plan that Khrushchev circulated for a monument to Stalin's victims. It never got built in his time. And then in 1962, Khrushchev himself forced the Presidium of the party to agree to the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a compelling and devastating portrait of the life of an average Soviet citizen one day in a Stalinist prison camp. Solzhenitsyn's Russian speaks in prison jargon, a jargon never heard before in Soviet literature, and the point of view, this commoner's point of view, spoke to the heart of all of those people that had been in the camps and the many intellectuals that knew that this part of the Soviet heritage would have to be dismissed, dealt with, and gotten behind the country. Khrushchev wasn't finished. In '63, he began to talk about party reform. And these reforms were very significant, although on the surface they look like trifles. He wanted to divide the party into agrarian and industrial sectors, and that at each level, that is the provincial level and the national level, these would be numerically equal. And his justification was that the proletariat should have a voice, and the peasantry that was allied with the proletariat should have an equal voice, and that's just fine and democratic. What lurks under the surface of this suggestion, however, is a split in the party, or rather, the making under the umbrella of the party of two parties. In other words, a pluralistic communist party. A very shrewd thing Khrushchev was trying to do. He tried to guarantee that at elections of party people and elections of Soviet people, that there would be staggered offices, and 1/3 of the office holders would turn over at every election. His idea was to make the party more democratic. Now, both of these reforms were resisted, and powerfully resisted, by Communist Party officials who looked askance at Khrushchev already for his bluster in foreign policy, who never had bought in to his schemes of de-Stalinizing, who were concerned about the control of the Soviet Empire and were angry below the surface about the events of 1956 in Poland and Hungary. So in October '64, Mr. Khrushchev went on vacation and he didn't come back. He was deposed from office by Brezhnev and his cronies Suslov and Kosygin. And when Khrushchev appealed the decision of the Presidium to the Central Committee, he got beat because this time the boys had learned their lesson. They had the votes and they were able to eliminate the threat of Khrushchev's successful appeal. Incidentally, Khrushchev was buried after his death in 1971, not in the wall where communists, honored communists are put, but in the New Maiden Monastery in Moscow, a place where second-level party officials are buried, but also where Anton Chekhov is buried, the great historian Sergei Solovyov, 19th century historian, is buried. I rather think that this is justice too. Khrushchev was put to rest with shades of people not like Stalin and Lenin, but with people of a different stamp. Now, about the Brezhnev years, one can say that on the surface, the regime set its teeth resolutely against de-Stalinization. The party reforms that Khrushchev recommended were blocked. Intellectuals were put under very close surveillance. Josef Brodsky was tried in 1964 for a crime so serious as being a poet who published without being a member of the Writers' Union. Terrible thing, huh? In 1966, the textbooks were revised by Brezhnev and company to make them more favorable to Stalin. Stop blackening our history in the way Khrushchev had done was one of the cries of the time. The writers Daniel and Sinyavsky were publicly tried in 1966, another warning shot at the intellectuals. In 1968, the Prague Spring, that hope of reform communism in Czechoslovakia, was crushed heinously by Soviet power and Brezhnev himself. By the 1970s, the regime had got emboldened to the point that it could raise the little monument to Stalin behind the Kremlin, behind the mausoleum. In 1970, it had got ruthless enough that it began to incarcerate dissidents in psychiatric institutions. And Solzhenitsyn, who found out about it, says, "This is a crime like Auschwitz, and they will never forget." He meant people everywhere in the world. They will never forget who perpetrated it. Solzhenitsyn himself, who had somehow managed to hang on in the netherworld of the dissidents, was arrested in 1974 and expelled because the KGB had come across the manuscript of the Gulag Archipelago, the greatest indictment, George Kennan tells us, since Dante's Inferno of any government. And of course, there was renewed hostility against Soviet Jews. But under the surface, Brezhnev did as much to de-Stalinize the country as Khrushchev because he permitted party personnel at the highest levels to live private lives, to be corrupt, and he refused to remove them from office. even when Grigory Romanov, the Leningrad party chief, gave a party in Leningrad for his daughter's wedding, and Catherine the Great's precious china was used at the party, and some of it was broken by the drunken guests. All Romanov got was a little slap on the hand. Really, Grigory, we cannot see that this is seemly for a communist to behave in such a way, but he was not removed from his position. And this inviolability of personnel is something for which Khrushchev had striven in the beginning, and under Brezhnev, the superficially anti-Stalinist leader, this aspect of de-Stalinization was finally achieved.